Carmine Salvi was on his knees in the alley behind the Ajax Social Club at 2:30 on a Friday morning, and he was crying. Not the quiet kind of crying that a man can hold inside his chest and call something else. The open, audible kind, the kind that soaks a collar and turns the jaw loose, the kind that makes a grown man's hands shake against wet brick where he has pressed them for support, searching for purchase that the brick will not give him. Ellsworth Johnson stood 6 feet away and did not move toward him. He held a small tin box in his left hand, rust on the hinge, a dent on the lid the size of a thumb, and he turned it once, slowly, twice, the way a man turns an object he has held before and intends to return to exactly the place he found it. He did not open it. He looked at it in the flat, deliberate way of a man taking inventory. Cora Simmons had come out of her laundry on 116th Street when the first car arrived, drawn by the sound of engines cutting at an unusual hour, and she had pressed herself flat against the doorframe of the building directly across from the alley entrance when she saw how many men there were and recognized the one who came last through the alley gate. Her breath went shallow. Her right hand found the metal edge of the doorframe, and her fingers locked around it and did not release. "Lord," she said to no one, because there was no one near enough to hear her in the dark. "That man is going to unmake somebody tonight." She was not wrong about which man she meant. She was not wrong about what was going to happen. She had lived on 116th Street for 19 years and she knew the difference between men who arrived to take something and men who arrived to collect something, and the one who had come last through that alley gate did not arrive to take. 8 soldiers had walked into Harlem 4 days earlier demanding tribute from every numbers runner on the west side of 116th. They had made explicit promises about what would happen to every runner and every runner's family if the money was not collected and delivered by Friday morning. They had taken a young man into a side alley and broken 2 of his fingers and 3 of his ribs and fractured his wrist and taken the only $340 he had ever managed to save in 22 years of careful living. 7 of those 8 soldiers were already inside the building at the far end of that alley. The 8th was on his knees in front of Ellsworth Johnson, and his name was Carmine Salvi, and he had not stopped speaking since he went down, cycling through offers and names and pleas and threats the way a drowning man cycles through every stroke he has ever known, looking for the one that still works. Bumpy did not respond to any of it. He turned the tin box once more and held it still. Not a single one of the 8 came back. This is that story. In the spring of 1950, the United States Senate was conducting a series of nationally televised hearings on organized crime in America, hearings that would carry the name of the Tennessee senator who chaired them, and those hearings produced in the public imagination a very specific and carefully framed picture of what organized crime in America looked like. It looked Italian. It looked like men in dark suits answering questions in controlled, clipped sentences or invoking their constitutional right to silence. It looked like a single, centralized network of violence and profit that extended from Chicago to New York to Miami and New Orleans, and the senators who crafted the questions and the television cameras that broadcast the answers treated this exposure as a discovery, as something new, as the revelation of a hidden architecture. What the hearings did not picture was Harlem. In the neighborhoods north of 110th Street, Italian organized crime families had been pushing systematically into the economics of black daily life. For more than 2 decades, not through direct ownership of businesses, but through the extraction of tribute from the numbers banks, the policy wheels, and the informal financial structures that black residents had built entirely outside of institutions that had never been constructed for them or made available to them. The banks would not lend to black businessmen in 1950. The police precincts that served Harlem would not investigate crimes that occurred exclusively between black residents, or crimes committed against black residents by men with organizational connections. The courts would not seat black jurors on cases involving black defendants accused by white witnesses with institutional affiliations. The tribute system the Lucchese family operated in Harlem in 1950 was not a new architecture. It was a tax on survival imposed by men who had correctly calculated that the people paying it had no alternative institution to appeal to, no protective mechanism that had ever functioned in their favor, and no recourse that did not require walking into a building specifically designed to produce the same outcome as no building at all. There was, however, Ellsworth Johnson. He had worked out of Harlem since the late 1920s, and by 1950 he had accumulated the kind of authority that does not appear in police reports, and does not require a formal title to be understood by everyone who lived within 6 blocks of his operation. He was not a politician. He was not a pastor. He was not a businessman in any sense that a bank would recognize. He was the infrastructure that the city's infrastructure had declined to build. On Tuesday, March 14, 1950, 8 men from the Lucchese family arrived on 116th Street before 8 in the morning, and what they found was a 22-year-old named Marcus Webb moving through the thin cold of the early street, counting slips, his lips moving slightly, his fingers working the bills against each other, the way he had worked them every morning for 3 years. Tuesday, March 14, 1950. 8:22 a.m. 116th Street and 7th Avenue, Harlem. The cold that morning had the smell of the river and coal smoke in it, the kind of cold that settles in the back of the nasal passages and does not release even when the sun is fully up, a cold with weight to it, a specific winter cold that everyone who grew up on those streets knew by name without having a name for it. The sidewalks were not empty. They were never fully empty, not at any hour, but the morning foot traffic pressed close to the building faces and moved with its eyes down, collars up, hands buried, breath dispersing above the sidewalk in small white bursts that dissolved before they reached the height of a man's chest. A pushcart vendor on the corner of 116th and 7th Avenue was arranging sweet potatoes in a low wooden crate by the wheel, and the sound of his gloved hands patting each potato into its place was the clearest and most distinct sound on the block for a long moment, a small, patient, domestic sound. Marcus Webb moved through the cold with the ease of a man who has made the same walk 5 mornings a week for 3 years without variation. He was 22 years old, lean through the shoulders in the way young men are lean who have not had enough to eat for most of their lives but have worked physically since they were 14. He wore a brown wool coat with a frayed left cuff, the fraying at the exact point where a sleeve rubs against a counter edge or a door handle when a man uses his hands for a living, and the coat had been let out twice at the seams and was now at the precise limit of what it could accommodate. At each stop on his route, a barber shop, a numbers drop behind a candy store, the back window of a laundry, the 3rd-floor apartment in a building whose front door was never fully latched, he would stop, receive the folded paper and whatever money accompanied it, and count the money twice before it went into the inside breast pocket of the coat. Always twice. Lips moving slightly, forefinger and thumb working the bills against each other with the specific pressure of a man who has learned through shortfalls that the count is the count and not an approximation. It was not distrust of the people handing him the collection. It was the knowledge that when the number was wrong at the end of the day, the difference came out of his own cut, and his cut had a destination. He was saving for a barbershop, not a vague or distant ambition that he kept in the way young men keep ideas about the future to make the present more survivable. A specific address. A specific number. He had already spoken twice to the landlord of the building at 125th Street and Lenox Avenue about the ground-floor commercial space that had been empty since the previous tenant moved out, and the landlord had given him the monthly figure, $60, and Marcus had written it in the small spiral notebook he kept in the left breast pocket of the coat alongside the day's slips. He had $340 in a dented tin box with a rusted hinge that he kept under the cot in the room he rented on 119th Street. He had done the arithmetic and redone it, and it held 4 more months of the route, careful with every dollar he didn't absolutely need to spend, and he would have enough for the first 3 months' rent and the basic equipment to open. He was on his 8th stop of the morning, coming out of the building on the west side of the block, when the 2 black cars pulled to the curb 40 feet ahead of him. You would not have identified them by the cars themselves. Ordinary vehicles on an ordinary block, engine noise cutting and then the ticking of metal contracting in the cold. But the 4 men who came out of the lead car placed themselves with the precise lateral spacing of men who have managed crowds before and are not thinking about where to stand. Their bodies know without instruction, and the 2 who emerged from the rear car stayed close to its driver's side door, which meant they were positioned as barriers, not as participants. The 6th man out of the rear car was Carmine Salvi. He was 41 years old, broad across the upper back, wearing a gray wool overcoat that carried too much weight for the season and gave his shoulders an architectural, squared-off look. His face was round, with a jaw that was slightly undershot, which gave his resting expression the cast of a permanent mild smirk. He had the specific physical confidence of a man who has not had to raise his own voice in several years because other men do that work for him. Before he spoke to Marcus, before he had taken 4 steps from the car door, he laughed. Not a social laugh, not an expression of anything. It was the brief, percussive sound he emitted before every sentence he ever spoke, a kind of involuntary throat clearing that functioned as a verbal runway, and everyone who had spent more than an hour in his company had long since stopped interpreting it as indicating anything about his state of mind. "Hey," he said, and the laugh preceded it by half a second. "You're one of Bumpy's boys." Marcus had gone still. Not the stillness of a man who is afraid, though his body had registered the lateral spacing and the positioning at the car door, and had already completed its assessment of the situation, but the stillness of a man who is deciding how much of what he is thinking to put in his face, and what to do with his hands. "I run my own route," Marcus said. Carmine Salvi smiled, and the smile outlasted the laugh by several seconds. "Sure you do." "Sure." He closed the remaining distance between them and stood close enough that Marcus could smell the tobacco and the heavy aftershave, and something else beneath both of those. "Here's what's happening. Starting today, 20% of every collection on this side of the street comes to us. Before it goes anywhere else. You tell whoever you tell. You tell Bumpy. This isn't a negotiation. This is how Tuesday mornings work now." Marcus's right hand, the one holding the folded collection from his 8th stop, tightened around the bills. His jaw moved once. His eyes did not move from Carmine Salvi's face. "I'll need to talk to somebody," Marcus said. The laugh came first. Then, "No. You won't." Carmine Salvi turned his head 30 degrees to the left, a precise and practiced movement, and one of the laterally spaced men moved. What happened next took 11 seconds. Sunday, March 12, 1950. 11:30 p.m. Back room of Garibaldi's Lounge, 110th Street. The back room at Garibaldi's had a fire door retrofitted with a slide bolt on the interior side, and the only light source was a single bare bulb on a cord above the round table in the center of the room, a table that still held the remnants of an earlier poker game, 2 empty tumblers, a deck missing its 4 kings, a heavy glass ashtray with 7 cigarette ends in it, none of them fully extinguished when they were put down. Carmine Salvi had been sitting at the head of that table for 40 minutes. The other 7 men in the room, Enzo Ferrara along the north wall, Sal Mancini and Vittorio Greco sharing the east wall, Bruno Lenza standing near the storage shelves, Tommy Rucci and Paulie Sistone seated at the far end of the table, Dominic Furio near the door with his arms folded, occupied the perimeter of the space in the various positions of men who are waiting without knowing precisely how long the waiting will continue. Carmine had a spiral notebook open on the table in front of him and a ballpoint pen in his right hand. He was writing names in the notebook in block capital letters, not his men's names but the names of the 6 runners who worked the West Side corridor, 6 names corresponding to 6 stops that accounted for the preponderance of the Tuesday and Wednesday collection. Under each name he had drawn a horizontal line and written a number representing the estimated weekly take from that stop. Numbers he had obtained through a contact at the bar on 110th who knew the routes by reputation. "Tuesday morning," he said. The laugh first, then the sentence. "All 6 stops. Same time, nothing sequential. We don't ask twice, we don't explain twice." He looked at Ferrara, who was the one with the steadiest hands and the clearest record. "Enzo, first stop at the laundry corner, he's there by 8:15. Sal and Vic take the newsstand and the candy store drops simultaneously, northwest quadrant." He tapped the notebook with the pen's cap. "Bruno and Tommy have the social club block, the 2 stops on the west side of the Ajax." He looked at Rucci and Sistone. "Paulie and Dom, you're in the cars. 1 on each end of the block. Nobody walks past you, nobody drives past you without you knowing it. He went through the assignments a second time from memory, without consulting the notebook. No one in the room asked for clarification, which was the configuration Carmine preferred and consistently produced through the specific combination of preparation and silence. Tommy Rucci said, after a long pause, "What about Johnson?" Not a question. The flat, procedural register of a man raising a scheduling concern. Carmine Salvi picked up the tumbler nearest to him and looked at the bottom of it, where a thin residue of scotch had dried into a ring. He set it back down without drinking from it. "Johnson is one man," he said. "And these people," he put the flat of his hand on the notebook page, "have nobody. They have never had anybody. You think there is a single person in this city who goes to war over a numbers runner in Harlem?" He capped the pen. He closed the notebook. He placed it in the inside breast pocket of his jacket with a practiced motion. "Nobody is coming for them. Nobody has ever come for them. That is the entire reason we are having this conversation." He stood. The meeting was over. Tuesday, March 14, 1950. 8:47 a.m. The alley behind the Ajax Social Club, 116th Street. They took Marcus into the alley. Two of them had his arms from behind and the third had his collar, and the movement from the sidewalk to the alley entrance happened in 4 seconds, smooth enough that the pushcart vendor at the corner looked up from his sweet potatoes and saw only the last edge of the group folding behind the brick wall of the Ajax's back face. The alley was 30 feet long between the club's exterior wall on one side and the adjacent building's foundation on the other, the surface uneven brick laid over decades of patchwork repair, dark and wet from the previous night's sleet, carrying the smell of standing water on old stone and the accumulated garbage of the building's rear bins. Marcus did not call out. He had already calculated what calling out would produce. You feel the shift before the blow arrives, a change in the grip pressure, a slight forward lean in the man to your right, a fraction of a second in which the body completes its assessment before the mind has finished its sentence. Bruno Lenza hit him across the left side of the face with the back of his right hand. The sound it made against the alley's brick walls was flat and dry, a brief report with no resonance. Marcus's head went left, and his knees bent, and his left hand went out and found the wall, and his fingers spread against the brick and pressed and held. He did not go down. Sal Mancini did not give him time to straighten his knees. He drove his right fist into Marcus's ribcage at the third rib from the bottom on the right side, and the sound that produced was distinct and clean in the enclosed channel of the alley, the sound a thick, greenwood branch makes when it snaps under lateral pressure, a crack with a wet undertone, and Marcus's breath left him completely and his body folded at the center, jackknifing forward from the hips, and he went to one knee on the wet brick with his left hand still flat on the wall and stayed there, either going further down nor coming back up, suspended between those two outcomes for 2 full seconds. Carmine Salvi stood at the alley entrance with both hands in the pockets of his gray overcoat, and watched with the attentiveness of a man observing a procedure he has ordered and wants carried out to specification. Tommy Rucci crouched and reached into the interior of Marcus's coat. Marcus's right hand moved on reflex, not a defensive grip, not an attempt to fight, simply the hand closing on Rucci's wrist because it had no other instruction at that moment, and Rucci responded by taking hold of Marcus's second and third fingers at their base and bending them backward at the proximal joints. The sound that produced was different from the rib. Softer. Wetter. Marcus's right hand released Rucci's wrist and went to the wall beside his left, and both hands pressed flat against the brick simultaneously, and neither of them moved again. Rucci took the week's collection from the interior breast pocket of the wool coat. He counted it without removing his gloves, $12.40, representing the full take from Marcus's first 8 stops of the morning. He handed it to Carmine without verbal comment. Then Rucci found the tin box. It was in the left exterior pocket of the coat, the rust-hinged tin box with the dent on the lid the size of a thumb, the box Marcus carried on his morning route every single day because at the end of each run he added his cut of the take to whatever was already inside, and the box carried $340 on that Tuesday morning, which was the accumulated weight of 3 years of working the 116th route, and every dollar he had not spent on anything else, the specific and Carefully calculated 4 months away, sum that stood between the room on 119th Street and the ground floor commercial space at 125th and Lenox. Rucci handed it to Carmine. Carmine opened it. He looked at the bills laid flat inside. He closed it. He slid it into the right pocket of his overcoat. "This is ours now," he said. Marcus was on both knees, both palms against the wall, his forehead lowering gradually toward the brick under the weight of what the kick had cost him. His breathing had become a controlled, structured effort, each inhale calibrated against the resistance of the cracked ribs on the right side, jaw clenched, eyes open and fixed on a specific point on the alley wall, the junction of 2 bricks approximately 18 inches from his face, as if he were navigating by that point and could not afford to lose it. Enzo Ferrara kicked him once in the lower back above the left kidney. The sound it made was a dull, dense thud with no secondary resonance. Marcus went fully down, cheek against the cold wet brick, right arm pinned beneath his chest, left arm extended along the base of the wall with the fingers still slightly spread, as if the hand were still looking for the handhold it had lost. Carmine crouched down until he was at Marcus's eye level. The hem of his gray overcoat spread out across the alley floor behind him. He held the tin box between his thumb and forefinger at the level of Marcus's face and let Marcus's eyes find it. "Tell Bumpy Johnson that this side of 116th is ours," he said. "You want to keep working it. 20% of every collection comes to me before it goes anywhere else, and it starts this week, and it does not stop. You go to the police." The laugh, abbreviated and cold. "And the next conversation we have happens at your brother's address on 119th Street. We know where Darnell lives. We know the name of the school he attends. We know his schedule better than he does." He stood. He straightened the overcoat. He walked out of the alley at a pace that had no urgency in it. And his 7 men followed him out in the same order they had entered, and the last of them passed the alley entrance at 8:54 in the morning. Marcus lay on the wet brick for 9 minutes before the mechanism of his body had recovered enough for him to get up. Tuesday, March 14, 1950. 10:18 a.m. Harlem Hospital, Emergency Ward. A nurse named Davis had written the preliminary intake notes in the compact, unhurried script of someone who records what is in front of her without editorializing. Laceration to the left cheekbone, approximately 2 inches in length, consistent with a ring or hard edge impact. Fracture of the 3rd and 4th ribs on the right side. Fractures to the 2nd and 3rd fingers of the right hand at the proximal phalanges. Significant contusion to the lower left back, consistent with blunt force. Impact. She had noted, in the same unaccented script, that Marcus Webb had walked to the hospital unassisted from an address on 116th Street, and she had entered this fact with the same brevity she used for everything else and moved on to the next line. He was sitting on the examination table when the doctor arrived, still in the brown wool coat with the frayed left cuff, his right hand held against the left side of his chest. The doctor's examination added one finding that the intake notes had not captured: a hairline fracture of the right wrist, visible on the X-ray as a faint diagonal line running from the proximal base of the thumb toward the lower radius. When the doctor told him this, Marcus looked at his right hand for a long time without speaking. He was right-handed. He had been right-handed his entire life. A man who cuts hair works with both hands, but the right hand carries the primary instrument, makes the primary motion, does the primary work. Darnell Webb arrived at 10:51 in the morning. He was 17, 4 inches shorter than his brother, with the same lean frame and the same physical quality of complete stillness. In moments that required it. He stood in the doorway of the examination room and looked at Marcus on the table, the taped midsection visible through the open hospital gown, the splinted and wrapped right hand, the dark dried line of blood along the ridge of the cheekbone, and he did not move or speak for a full 10 seconds. Marcus's eyes went to his brother. His jaw tightened. He spoke slowly because each full breath carried a specific cost, and he was managing the expenditure. "Don't," he said. "Whatever you're already thinking, don't. You hear me? You keep your head down and you keep saving in you." He stopped. He started again. When I get out of here, we go to 125th. You and me. We go look at that space together. That is what we are going to do. Darnell's right hand had closed into a fist at his side. He did not open it. 2 detectives from the 32nd Precinct arrived at 11:34 in the morning. Detective Walter Gaines, 44 years old, and a younger partner whose name did not appear anywhere in the hospital's records from that morning. Gaines took the single chair in the room and wrote in a small notebook while his partner remained standing near the door. Marcus gave them everything: the description of Carmine Salvi, the names of 2 of the other men he had seen clearly enough to describe, the tin box, the time, the alley. He told them about the threat regarding Darnell's address. Gaines wrote. He turned a page. He asked one clarifying question about which side of the street the cars had been parked on. Then he closed the notebook. Here's what I can tell you, Gaines said. We bring these men in, it is their word against yours. There are no independent witnesses to the assault, no physical evidence beyond your injuries, which any defense attorney will argue occurred in a different context. The district attorney is not going to file on this. He stood and adjusted his hat with the brim of 2 fingers. These disputes between numbers operators have a way of settling themselves out. I'd recommend staying off the west side route for the time being. He and his partner left. Darnell went to the window and watched them descend the hospital steps and cross to their car. Both his hands came up to the glass and pressed flat against it, and his breath was fogging the lower third of the pane, and he stood there without moving until the car turned the corner and was gone. Tuesday, March 14, 1950. 2:14 p.m. 120th Street, above the Velvet Room's social club. Ellsworth Johnson was at the table reviewing the week's collection sheets when Luther Briggs came in from the hallway. Luther was 40 years old and had been in Bumpy's operation for 11 years, and he had developed over that time the specific discipline of a man who knows how to enter a room carrying information that requires attention. He came in fully, he closed the door behind him, and he did not speak until his feet had stopped moving and he was standing still. His hat was in his right hand rather than on the rack beside the door, where he placed it as a matter of fixed habit every time he entered this room, and that deviation was the first visible indicator of what kind of information he was carrying. Bumpy looked up from the collection sheets. Luther told him. He worked forward from the time the cars arrived on 116th, through the assault, to the hospital admission, with 3 source confirmations: a woman who had been at the near corner and seen the men emerge from the cars and the shape of what followed, a boy who ran errands for the Ajax Social Club and had seen enough from the alley entrance to describe the physical details, and a contact at Harlem Hospital who had read the intake chart and copied the relevant portions. Luther gave him the name Carmine Salvi, sourced from the woman's description cross-reference with a contact at a bar 2 blocks from Garibaldi's who recognized the description. Bumpy set his pen down on the collection sheet. His jaw moved once, a single slight contraction, and went still. His left hand, which had been holding the edge of the collection sheet, placed it flat on the table with a careful, measured motion. His right hand folded on the table in front of him and remained folded. He looked at the wall across the room for 4 seconds. How many men? He said. 8. Luther kept the recitation direct. Carmine Salvi is the head. The ground men were Enzo Ferrara, Sal Mancini, Vittorio Greco, Bruno Lenza, and Tommy Rucci. Paulie Sistone and Dominic Furio were car men. Same morning. More than 1 stop. 3 stops confirmed, possibly more. The laundry corner first, then the newsstand on 8th, then the 116th route where Marcus was working. Marcus was the only one they put hands on. At the other stops the runners gave them the collection without resistance. Bumpy unfolded his right hand and placed it flat on the table beside his left. He looked at both of them for a moment. Where does Carmine meet? Back room at Garibaldi's on 110th, Sunday nights. Consistent operation. Who else? Who else did they touch this week that hasn't come to me yet? Luther took a folded piece of paper from the inside pocket of his jacket and placed it on the table. There was a 16-year-old on the 119th block. He is not in the hospital. He handed over the collection and they let him go, but they took his route book. Which means they have the account names and addresses for every stop on that section. Bumpy looked at the paper for a moment without touching it. Then he picked it up and unfolded it, and read it for 30 seconds without moving his eyes from the page. He set it down. He named 2 men, Raymond Oates and Calvin Pierce, and gave Luther 5 sentences of specific instruction, 1 for each of them, and 3 additional directives covering coverage, timing, and a 3rd category of preparation that required a different kind of contact. He delivered those 3 directives in 2 sentences, without raising his voice or repeating them. At the bottom of the folded paper, below Luther's own handwriting, there was a brief note in a different hand, the hospital contacts. It described an item from Marcus Webb's personal effects, held in the hospital's intake storage, a rust-hinged tin box with a dent in the lid. "Get it," Bumpy said. The tin box was on the corner of his table at 4:30 in the afternoon. Wednesday, March 15, 1950. 9:05 a.m. 120th Street, above the Velvet Room's social club. Darnell Webb came through the door without knocking. He was wearing his school clothes, a pressed white shirt tucked into dark trousers, the clothes of a boy who had put on the day's best presentation before walking into a room he had not been to before, and he had been waiting outside the building since before Bumpy's men arrived at their posts for the morning, which meant he had been standing in the cold since before 7. He carried a .22 caliber revolver in the waistband of his trousers at the right hip, covered by the shirt's tail, and he had it positioned with the stiff, overly conscious posture of a person who has never carried a weapon and is therefore constantly aware of the weight and location of this one, his right hand periodically drifting to his side in the unconscious gesture of a person checking that the thing is still there. Luther Briggs was in the room, standing near the wall to the right of the door, hat in hand. He did not speak or move after Darnell came in. Bumpy was at the table, reading. He turned the page before he looked up. Darnell pulled the revolver from his waistband and placed it on the table between them. Not dropped, placed, with care and deliberateness, with the barrel pointed sideways, the gesture of a person making a statement about intention rather than issuing a direct threat. His right hand stayed on the grip. "I know which bar he uses," Darnell said. His voice was steady in the specific way of compressed things, the steadiness that precedes a fracture rather than the steadiness that follows one. "I know what nights he's there and what time he arrives. I can be in that bar tonight before he gets there, and I can." "What did Marcus say to you at the hospital?" Bumpy said. Darnell's right hand left the grip. It went to the table edge. His eyes went to Bumpy's face. "He told you to keep your head," Bumpy said. "He told you to save up and go look at the space on 125th together. That is what he said to you." Darnell's throat moved. "He has a fractured wrist," he said. "A barber. His right hand. I know what he has," Bumpy said. He stood from the table, slowly, without any urgency in the motion. He crossed to the table's other side and picked up the .22 by the barrel and held it for a moment, then opened the top left drawer of the desk and set the gun inside and closed the drawer. He came back and sat on the edge of the table with his feet flat on the floor and his arms folded in front of him. "Tell me what you think actually happens," he said, "after you walk into that bar tonight. Not what you want to happen. What happens?" Darnell did not answer immediately. His eyes had gone to the drawer. His jaw worked at something without producing sound. "You do not come back," Bumpy said. "That is the first version. Or the second version, you do come back, and before the week ends there is a conversation at your address on 119th Street, the conversation they told Marcus would happen there. The one about Darnell's schedule. The one about the school." He unfolded his arms and placed his hands on the table edge on either side of him. "Your brother did not tell you to hold your head so that you could throw it away 3 blocks from a bar." Darnell's eyes had found the tin box on the far corner of the table. He had seen it the moment he walked through the door, and had not looked directly at it until now. "What Marcus wanted," Bumpy said, "was a barber shop on 125th Street. He told me that himself, 18 months ago, the day he asked to take the 116th route. He told me he wanted to work it until he had enough saved to open. He was 4 months away. He paused. He let the number sit. 4 months. The room held still for a long moment. Outside the window, the street made its ordinary sounds. I am going to close the account, Bumpy said. And I am going to close it correctly, in a way that holds and does not invite a response. When that is done, the shop on 125th is going to open. It is going to open with your name on the trade license and Marcus's name on the door, and you are going to spend the next 4 years learning the trade thoroughly enough to run it for the rest of your working life. He reached across to the corner of the table and picked up the tin box and held it out. This is yours. It was his, which means it is yours. Do not spend it. Add to it every week until you have the rest. Darnell took the box. He held it in both hands, the way he would hold something he was afraid of dropping. When the accounting happens, I will bring you, Bumpy said. You come in, you say what you came to say, and then you walk out before anything else begins. And after that, you go to 125th Street. That is the only thing you do after. Darnell looked at the tin box. He turned it once, slowly, in his hands. All right, he said. Thursday, March 16, 1950. 11:58 p.m. Garibaldi's Lounge, 110th Street. The back room at Garibaldi's Lounge was the same room it had been on Sunday. The same bare bulb over the round table. The same ashtray, now holding 11 cigarette ends rather than 7. Carmine Salvi had arrived at 11 o'clock with all 7 of his men, the full complement of the Thursday operation, which had been the specific configuration that Raymond Oates confirmed when he exited the building through the back entrance at 11:45 and walked to the corner of 111th Street without looking over his shoulder. From the bar's front room, through the gap at the bottom of the fire door, a thin ribbon of music was audible, something with a trumpet prominent in the arrangement, something from the radio rather than live, muffled by the door's thickness to the point of being more texture than melody. Carmine had his jacket draped over the back of his chair and the top button of his collar open and a glass of scotch in front of him that he had refilled twice since 11 and was working toward a third. And he was 11 minutes into a story about a racetrack in New Jersey and a man named Eddie Palazzo who had owed him $400 since August and kept producing novel explanations for why August had not yet concluded in any practical sense, and the men around the table were producing. The laughter that is produced in such situations, the laughter that has the correct volume and timing but runs slightly behind the punchline, the laughter of men who are paying attention to the room rather than to the story. Vittorio Greco heard the bolt. He was seated closest to the fire door, which was why he heard it, a metallic sound brief and specific, the sound of a bolt disengaging from its housing, which was not a sound that should have been physically possible because the bolt was on the interior side of the door and was currently in the locked position, and Greco's hand went to his hip before he had fully processed what the sound meant. And he was rising from his chair when the door opened and 3 men came through it who had not come from anywhere inside the bar. They did not move fast. They moved with the methodical lateral spacing of men who have already memorized the room's dimensions and the position of everyone in it, and are therefore not looking at the space but at the people, and the man on the right had something held low at his side, and Greco's hand was still on his hip, not yet at the draw. When the man on the right told him to put both hands flat on the table, Greco put both hands flat on the table. The door on the room's opposite side, the hallway door connecting to the bar's back corridor, opened 11 seconds later and 2 more men came through it. Sal Mancini was standing by then, and Bruno Lenza had interposed the chair between himself and the incoming men in the reflexive way of someone whose hands have reached for something useful before his mind issued the instruction, and neither Mancini nor Lenza was told twice what to do with the chair and with their hands. Tommy Rucci stayed in his seat, both hands visible on the table in front of him, his face arranged in the expression of a man running calculations behind it. Paulie Sistone did not move from his chair. Dominic Furio did not move from his position near the storage shelves. Enzo Ferrara, who was known in every room he had ever worked in for having the steadiest hands of any man in the organization, placed his hands flat on the table with a precise, deliberate motion that carried exactly the quantity of information it was intended to carry. Carmine Salvi had not moved. His Scotch glass was in his right hand and he held it without drinking, and his jaw had gone completely still, which was a condition no one in that room had previously observed, because Carmine Salvi's jaw was never still before he spoke. It moved. It produced the laugh. It produced the sentence. The jaw going still before speech was a thing that had not happened before. The front fire door opened a second time. Ellsworth Johnson came in. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit with a white pocket square folded in the breast pocket, and black leather shoes, and the shoes made a clean, unhurried sound on the concrete floor, each step placed with the deliberateness of a man who has decided in advance where he is going and has no reason to arrive quickly. He followed the direct line from the door to the round table, took the chair. At the head of the table, Carmine's chair, the one with Carmine's jacket draped over its back, pulled it out, and sat in it. He placed the tin box on the table where the ashtray had been and where every person in the room could see it. He did not speak immediately. He let the room hold the silence for 8 seconds. Carmine set his glass down. He produced a laugh, the first time it had appeared since the bolt turned. He said, "This is a misunderstanding. Whatever you were told, it is not what it looks like. I can make this right. You had an agreement with the Genovese family regarding the 116th corridor," Bumpy said. Past tense. Carmine's face made a small adjustment. The smirk recalibrated itself. "Let me get you a sit-down. With the family directly, with whoever you want in the room, we set a number and you had access to those runners because they operated in that corridor without interference," Bumpy said. Past tense. "Bumpy." Carmine's voice shifted register, something moving through it now from below the surface. "There doesn't have to be a problem of this scale. You name a percentage, I go back to my people tonight, and we have this corrected by morning. The kid gets his money back, whatever he needs. This entire situation disappears. You had 7 men in a room on Sunday night who knew the details of your plan 48 hours before Marcus Webb was in the alley on 116th Street. Bumpy said. He opened the tin box and turned it so the open face pointed at Carmine. All 7 of them are in this room. Carmine's hands moved to the table edge. He gripped it. He looked around the room once, at his men, at Bumpy's men positioned between them, and he looked back at Bumpy, and for the first time that night the laugh did not precede the next sentence. I have relationships in this precinct, he said. Relationships that have been in place for a long time. You move against me and every badge in this borough comes north before morning. I am telling you to think about what you are actually doing here. Detective Walter Gaines of the 32nd Precinct told Marcus Webb that situations like his tend to resolve on their own. Bumpy said. He closed the tin box. He stood. He was right. Cora Simmons was at the corner of 110th Street and Lenox Avenue at 12:22 in the morning, not by design. She had worked late at the laundry on 116th and was on her way home, when 4 cars came out of the service alley beside Garibaldi's lounge and turned south in close formation, headlights on. Moving at the pace of men who are not in a hurry because everything that needed to happen before this drive has already happened. She recognized the man in the lead car through the glass as it passed beneath the streetlight. She turned and crossed to the opposite sidewalk without breaking her stride and kept walking without looking back until she had rounded the next corner, and her right hand, the entire time, was closed around the strap of her bag as if the strap were the edge of a door frame. Carmine Salvi was in the second car. His mouth had not closed since they walked him out of the back room. Friday, March 17, 1950. 2:30 a.m. The alley behind the Ajax Social Club, 116th Street. The alley behind the Ajax smelled the same as it had smelled on Tuesday morning, garbage and old stone and the mineral cold of rain that had dried without fully drying, the persistent damp of a surface that does not receive enough direct light to lose its moisture. The same 30 feet of uneven brick between the same 2 walls, the Ajax's exterior on one side and the adjacent building's foundation on the other. The same narrow vertical opening above, the same black ladder profiles of the fire escapes against the sky. The surface of the alley floor was the same surface Marcus Webb had lain on, with his cheek against the brick and his left arm extended and his fingers still slightly spread. 8 battery-powered electric torches had been positioned on the ground along the east wall at regular intervals, and the light they threw came from below rather than above, which made the alley brighter than it had been on any morning and threw every surface into sharper definition than daylight would have achieved, every crack in the brick, every seam in the mortar, every face in the space more distinct and more exposed than any overhead light source would have rendered it. 8 men were positioned against the west wall where Marcus had put his hands on Tuesday. Bumpy set the tin box on an overturned wooden crate near the alley entrance, and stood behind the crate. He opened the tin box and removed its contents, not money, but a single folded sheet of paper that Luther had placed inside it the previous evening, a sheet on which 8 names had been written in block capital letters: Carmine Salvi, Enzo Ferrara, Sal Mancini, Vittorio Greco, Bruno Lenza, Tommy Rucci, Paulie Sistone, Dominic Furio. Bumpy held the paper for a moment, then folded it once along its original crease and placed it on top of the closed tin box. Darnell Webb entered the alley at 2:41 in the morning. He was wearing the white shirt and the dark trousers, the same clothes he had worn to Bumpy's office the previous morning. He carried nothing. He walked to the midpoint of the alley space and stood there, between Bumpy at the entrance end and the 8 men against the west wall, and he looked at Carmine Salvi the way a person looks at something they have spent 2 full days constructing the correct expression for, and what his face actually produced when he found it was not the expression he had constructed. He turned to face the 8 men along the wall. "My brother is 22 years old," he said. His voice was completely even. "He has a fractured wrist on his right hand and 2 broken fingers on the same hand and 3 cracked ribs, and he walked from this alley to Harlem Hospital on 135th Street by himself on Tuesday morning because there was no one on this street, or in that building or in this neighborhood who was in a position to help him do it." He stopped. He let that land. He worked this route for 3 years. He counted every collection slip twice. He put money in a tin box every single day for those 3 years, and he had a specific number he was working toward and a specific address and a specific month when he was going to walk in and write his name at the bottom of a lease. He looked directly at Carmine Salvi. "You put $340 in your coat pocket," Darnell said. "You walked out of this alley, and you thought that was the conclusion." He picked up the tin box from the overturned crate. He held it in both hands, the same way he had held it in Bumpy's office. "I am going to open a barbershop on 125th Street and Lenox Avenue," he said. "Marcus Webb Barbershop. I am going to learn the trade properly, and I am going to open that shop, and I am going to cut hair in it for the rest of my working life. And every person who sits in that chair is going to know exactly why the shop exists, and exactly whose 3 years of work and every dollar he didn't spend built it." His voice had not changed register from the first word to this one. "That is what I came here to say. That is all." He looked once at the 8 men. He looked once more at Carmine Salvi. He turned and walked to the alley entrance and stepped out of it onto the sidewalk. He did not look back. Bumpy listened to the sound of Darnell's footsteps until they diminished past the audible threshold. Then he picked up the folded paper from the top of the tin box and opened it. He read the first name. Carmine Salvi was the first account closed. 1 sentence, 1 specific implement in the hand of the man standing to Bumpy's right, 1 report against the east wall, the same east wall Marcus had pressed his hands against, and the name was completed. Enzo Ferrara. 1 sentence. Sal Mancini. 1 sentence. Vittorio Greco, who had the steadiest hands of any man in the organization, was shaking before his name was called. Bruno Lenza. Tommy Rucci, the man who had bent Marcus Webb's fingers backward and taken the tin box from his coat pocket. Paulie Sistone, who had been in the car. Dominic Furio, who had also been in the car. 8 names. 8 sentences. The east wall of the alley behind the Ajax Social Club on 116th Street. It took 19 minutes. Friday, March 17, 1950. 6:15 a.m. The alley behind the Ajax Social Club, 116th Street. Detective Frank Moran of the 28th Precinct arrived 38 minutes after a man whose name he never obtained called the dispatcher and described the location and the nature of what was there. Moran was 47 years old, had been on the force for 22 years, and walked the length of the alley from its entrance to the west wall at the far end and back again in the unhurried way of a man estimating the scope of a renovation project he has been asked to price. He lit a cigarette at the alley entrance. His junior partner, Detective Cruz, 3 years on the force, had his notebook open and had been writing for approximately 90 seconds before he stopped. "What classification?" Cruz said. Moran looked at the wall. He looked at the fire escape above it. He looked at the uneven surface of the alley floor. He drew on the cigarette once. "Numbers operation," he said. "Internal dispute. Organized crime element against organized crime element." He moved to the alley entrance and dropped the cigarette and put his heel on it. "These situations within the organized crime structure have a way of resolving themselves. That's the case here." Cruz wrote it down. He wrote the date and the time and the location on the top line of the page and underlined them. Moran walked out of the alley. He did not return to it. At 9:45 that same morning, a man named Dominic Ferrante, a Lucchese family capo who maintained a dry goods import business on the west side as a legitimate commercial operation, arrived at a diner on 121st Street and took the rear booth on the left side. He waited 11 minutes before a man who worked for Bumpy Johnson sat down across from him. Ferrante had brought an envelope, which he placed on the table between the bread basket and the 2 cups of coffee the waitress had already set out. The man who worked for Bumpy did not touch the envelope. "Mr. Johnson's operational territory on the west side, including the 116th corridor and all associated runner networks, will not be a subject of any future discussion," Ferrante said. His voice was the voice of a man reading from a prepared statement that he has reviewed enough times to deliver without the paper. "What happened last Tuesday was a miscommunication that originated outside proper channels. It has been fully corrected." The man across from him looked at the envelope. Then at Ferrante. "The 8 men," he said. Ferrante's right hand moved to the bread basket. He shifted one piece of bread 1 inch to the left and left his hand there. "There are no 8 men," he said. "There is an alley behind a social club on 116th Street where something occurred that this organization is not able to account for, and is not going to attempt to account for. That is the position of this family. That is the position going forward." He looked at his coffee. "Permanently." The man who worked for Bumpy picked up the envelope and placed it in his interior jacket pocket and left the booth. Marcus Webb spent 11 weeks in Harlem Hospital and then in the recovery care of a physician on 119th Street who had more experience with the specific mechanics of the injury than the hospital's rotation had offered. The hairline fracture of the wrist healed at a slightly altered angle that left a permanent low-level tremor in the right hand at full extension, a tremor Marcus learned to work around. By developing a technique based on small, controlled movements rather than the long strokes he had originally planned to learn. He returned to active cutting in 1952, when his brother's shop opened, and he worked there 6 days a week without interruption until 1971. On every Saturday morning from the first week the shop was open, he placed a single dollar bill in the tin box that sat on the shelf behind the first chair near the window, and he continued this practice until the accumulated total inside the box exceeded the assessed value of the shop's fixtures and lease. Detective Walter Gaines of the 32nd Precinct was transferred to a clerical assignment at the Staten Island Ferry Administrative Office in April of 1950 under circumstances that appeared in no personnel file with a clear explanation. He worked that assignment until his retirement in 1963. He never took a Harlem case again. He developed, during the years that followed, a habit of arriving at his desk 17 minutes before the start of each shift, which his colleagues attributed to professional diligence, and which he did not correct. Detective Frank Moran of the 28th Precinct officially closed the alley case behind the Ajax Social Club in March of 1950 as an unresolved organized crime dispute, and did not reopen it. He remained assigned to the Harlem area until 1957. During that period he filed 2 additional case closures using substantially the same language he had used in the alley on 116th Street. Dominic Ferrante operated the dry goods import business on the West Side until 1958, when the Kefauver Committee's continuing federal pressure forced a significant restructuring of the Lucchese family's New York commercial infrastructure. He relocated to Florida in 1959 and died there in 1974. He dispatched no men into the Harlem Numbers territory at any point after March of 1950. Cora Simmons continued operating the laundry at 116th Street until 1967, when she sold the business to a nephew. In the years following 1950, she developed a habit when passing the alley entrance behind the Ajax, a slight slowing of her pace, a single look at the east wall of the alley, and then a continuation of her walk without stopping or changing expression. She told her granddaughter once, in the summer of 1963, that Harlem had a form of protection that was not documented in any official record and that the people who benefited from it often did not know its source, but that a person who had been paying attention for long enough could recognize its shape in the absence of certain events that never occurred. She attended the opening of the Marcus Webb barbershop in the spring of 1952, arrived when the door opened, and stayed for 4 hours. She was among the first 6 people in the neighborhood to read the name on the door and to understand, without needing to ask, exactly why that name was there. Ellsworth Johnson received no official or public acknowledgement of anything that occurred between Tuesday, March 14, and Friday, March 17, 1950. He continued operating in Harlem for 28 more years. Between 1950 and 1968 he funded 11 scholarships through informal and undocumented channels, dispersed to young men in the neighborhood who had the specific kind of ability that had no institutional pathway available to it. The first of those scholarships was designated for a 17-year-old named Darnell Webb, who used it to complete a 2-year barbering program at a trade school in the Bronx and graduated in June of 1952. Darnell Webb opened the Marcus Webb barbershop at 125th Street and Lenox Avenue on April 19, 1952, 2 years, 1 month, and 5 days after his brother lay on the cold brick of the alley behind the Ajax Social Club with his hands pressed against the east wall. He operated the shop for 41 consecutive years. Over that period he trained 23 apprentices, most of them young men from the surrounding blocks for whom the shop represented the available entry point into a trade that could sustain a working life. He never spoke publicly about what had occurred in March of 1950, or about what he had said in the alley on 116th Street in the early morning of March 17th. He maintained one practice without variation across all 41 years of operation. On the first Friday of each month, he closed the shop 2 hours before its posted closing time. He did not schedule those hours with other work. He sat in the first chair, the chair nearest the window that faced 125th Street, and he did not cut hair, and he did not read, and he did not turn on the radio. He sat in the chair that his brother had spent 3 years walking a cold morning route to earn the right to sit in, and he watched the street outside move through the late afternoon light the way streets move when no specific thing is being watched for. In 41 years of that practice, he never explained to anyone what he was watching for. The shop is still open. 2 trials happened in Harlem in March of 1950. The first was conducted in an alley in 11 seconds and concluded with a detective's notebook entry that labeled it an internal dispute and closed the case in the time it took to smoke a cigarette. The second was conducted in the same alley in 19 minutes and concluded with a Mafia family issuing a permanent territorial concession across a diner table on 121st Street. Both trials were held without counsel, without a jury, without a public record, and without appeal. Both produced a verdict that held. Whether what Ellsworth Johnson did in those 72 hours was justice, or revenge, or some third category for which the existing moral and legal vocabulary of 1950 had no precise term, that is not a question this account is going to answer. The record of what he did, what he refused to do, and what he built in the space between doing and refusing is available. That record is its own argument. In 1950, 8 men arrived in Harlem operating under the complete certainty that the people who lived there had no recourse, no protector, and no mechanism for response. That certainty had been constructed and maintained by 100 years of American legal architecture, banking policy, policing practice, and deliberate institutional design. It was not irrational. It was, in almost every case that preceded that Tuesday morning, correct. Marcus Webb deserved to open his barbershop in the spring of 1950 with an unbroken hand. If you believe that, drop a like on this video. If you understand why Bumpy Johnson did what he did in the hours that followed, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next account, because the history that the official record declined to keep is the history that still matters. Marcus Webb. His name is on the door.